Today I'm going through every single book I read in 2023 and I'm going to pick out the best ones or the ones I like the most and tell you whether or not you should read them. Let's begin because it's a long list. At the time of recording this, it is halfway through December and I have read 36 full books thus far. My goal at the beginning of the year was to read 10, so I am very, very happy with what I've done. Last year I set a goal to read like 4 books and I read something like 25, so I knew I could do 10 this year. I was definitely in the pleasure read mode for this year, so let's begin. The first book I read this year was I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman. I personally was not the biggest fan of this book. It felt like it was kind of like fan fiction when I was reading it. I wouldn't really recommend that to anyone who's like older than 14. The next book I read was Dealing with Dragons by Patricia C. Reed. This is sort of like a young reader book, and this is definitely a perfect example of how even young reader books can be incredibly enjoyable. The writing in this book is so fun. I really, really love this, and this was definitely one of the best books I read this year. I'm also remembering this has like gender stuff in it. There's a female dragon who's maybe going to become the Dragon King, and that's not even a big deal. That is a big slay. The next 2 books I did read on my Kindle. I did a ton of reading on my Kindle this year. I love this thing. I've got the Paperwhite, so it's got a reading light built in. I always keep it on the warm setting, of course, for my eyeballs. And I love that you can adjust the font size. That's been coming in handy because my eyes, I need an eye exam. So actually the past like couple weeks I've been solely reading on my Kindle, but that's not the topic of the video. The next 2 books I read were Once Upon a Broken Heart and The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. I feel like these books were really hyped up on like BookTube and Book Talk, and like, okay, I read them, but I kind of felt like I was being held hostage. Like I did not really like love them. To me, these are definitely not must reads in the way that like I feel like everybody else was saying they were. Next, I read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I borrowed this copy of this book and I haven't given it back yet. Apparently that is my job as the person who borrowed it, but it's been a while and I still have it. This book is incredible. This was definitely one of the best books I read this year. I read this in about like 4 days, and the last 2 days I was honestly savoring it. Like I was trying not to read it all at once because it just was incredible. She's an incredible writer. I cannot wait to see what she writes next because this was just amazing. And I'm not someone who reads memoirs. Like this was so easy to read. Like it just flowed so well. So if you are someone who's like avoiding this because it's a memoir, that's not a reason. Like this is really incredible. The next book I read was actually a reread, and that was A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin. This was her debut novel and I just like love this. This is a comfort book for me. It's just kind of like a basic rom-com Regency era. Like I loved it, you know. I loved it. It was so fun to read, and this was definitely like, it would go on my like best books list, but in the sort of way that it's a favorite of mine and not necessarily in a like, this is an amazing piece of literature way. I absolutely love this author though, and I did read her second book this year. The next one I read was The Heist by Janet Ivanovich and Lee Goldberg. This was so like cop vibes. The protagonist is such a cop. I did not like this. I did not find the protagonist like appealing at all, so yeah, just was not for me. I'm definitely not the target audience for this. The next book I read was The Tombs of Atuan by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is the second book in the Earthsea cycle, and oh my god, this was so good. I love Ursula K. Le Guin. I talked about her a lot last year when I did sort of a reading wrap up. This was amazing. This actually follows a different protagonist than the first book, although the protagonist from the first book does come into this one, but we follow a girl in this one, and it's just so freaking good. I loved it. I was worried because I had waited a full year from reading the first one to read this one, and it was perfect timing. Like it just made so much sense. This is definitely one of the best books I read this year. Next up, I read the Bridge Kingdom books by Danielle L. Jensen. Guys, like I'm literally rereading the third book right now because the fourth one finally came out and I wanted to like refresh myself, and honestly I wish I had gone back from the beginning because it would make the third book like so much more satisfying. So the books are The Bridge Kingdom, The Traitor Queen, and The Inadequate Heir. That's what I read. They're on Kindle Unlimited, so I love these books so much. They're definitely like fantasy romance, and they're adult romances, so they do have some like smutty scenes. The first book I think only has like one, and it's kind of close to the end, and the other books have some more in them. Smut scenes like sometimes make me cringe, but like I try not to cringe at them because I recognize it's just me like posing judgment on myself, you know, for reading them, when in reality like I feel like it's kind of pretty realistic to include those in books like these, which are about like war and love. But these books have like a lot of political intrigue. I hate the Kindle covers. There are other covers for the physical books that I think are a lot prettier, but these ones are definitely like, you look at that and you're gonna come up with a judgment about what that book is like. I just love them so much. And you know what? I am gonna say they were some of the best books I read this year because I am rereading them right now. So if you like romance, if you like political intrigue, if you like freaking violence and shit, like that's all in here. Sword fighting. It's kind of a slay. It's realistic fantasy. It's very epic, and the world building is fantastic. They might be a little slow to get into, but just like, I just like them so much. And to be fair, I don't really remember the first and the second too well, or like how I felt about the protagonists in there. I think I felt so sometime. Nonetheless, this series has me in a chokehold. The next book I read this year was The Hobbit by J.R. Tolkien. I read that on my Kindle because it was on Kindle Unlimited. And honestly, I really liked it. I guess it would go on the best books I read this year, like duh. It was very well written. It was fun to read. I would say the last like 20% definitely like felt like I was lagging a little bit, and I think I liked it more because I had watched the Hobbit movies, because I feel like I'm imagining things, or like I know where the story's going and it's making me excited. Like with Pride and Prejudice, like watching the movie before reading the book was like a must for me. Same with Emma. But I did really enjoy like the voice that told the story of The Hobbit. I thought it was really great. Next up, I read The Heart of the Raven Prince by Tessonia Odette, also on my Kindle, I think on Kindle Unlimited. Sometimes I just read books that are on Kindle Unlimited because I can easily get them, like my mom has it, so I have it. A lot of times that means I'm reading like romance books that aren't the most fleshed out, or maybe are new authors. I don't know if this one falls into like that specific category. The Heart of the Raven Prince is a retelling of maybe like Cinderella. I don't remember who it is. And I have fun reading it, but I do not remember anything that happened in that book, so evidently it's gone from my memory. I think it would be a book I would be open to rereading though. And I remember enjoying it while I was reading it. And if you do end up liking it, she has a bunch of other books that are like fairy tale retellings that are in the same world, which I do think is very cool. After that, I read The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. This was very like viral this year. It's sort of just a short thriller book. I read it in like a day on an airplane, and it was great. I mean, I enjoyed it a lot. It kind of like had similar twists and turns to a different thriller book I read last year, and I think it's definitely worth a read. Like if you want to read a thriller book, but if you don't want to be like too like freaked out and scared, I don't think I felt very like scared when I was reading it. I was just like in suspense. After that, I finished Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This took me like the first 4 months of the year to read. I was kind of reading this in between all my other books that I was reading because this one was so heavy, dude. Trigger warnings. Jesus. This book is definitely like convoluted as hell. And here's the thing, I love Six of Crows. I love Crooked Kingdom. If you haven't read them, what are you doing? And I haven't read any of the other books from the Grisha universe, but I did go for this one, which is her first like adult fiction book, I believe. Really had to put this one down so I didn't get depressed. And I think the last half of the book only went by a little better because I was listening to like my high vibe frequency music when I was reading it, so it didn't feel so heavy. Like it felt instead a little optimistic. So yeah, if you're gonna read this book, be mentally prepared. But it was a great book. It was convoluted, but I do feel like it was kind of worth it. After I finished that, I actually went back to Frida McFadden with The Housemaid's Secret, which is sort of like a second installment in the Housemaid series. I definitely found it satisfying coming from the first one and was worth the read if you enjoyed the first one. Next, I read Beach Read by Emily Henry. I did not love this book, and I actually listened to Book Lovers, an audiobook, like last month, so I feel like I have kind of crystallized my Emily Henry opinion, which is I'm not going to be reading any more of her books. I'm just not the biggest fan. She definitely starts to sort of philosophize. I don't know where the right emphasis is in that word. She kind of like goes into sort of the philosophy of the characters in a very like outright way, on the nose, and I'm just like not into it. Like I don't want people to like talk their philosophical thoughts at me. So I feel like that's my only, that would be like the hottest take I have probably. Next up, I read The Prison Healer, The Gilded Cage, and The Blood Trader, which are a trilogy by Lynette Noni. I honestly really liked these books. I think the third one I liked a lot because it was sort of like expansive, like you were kind of out in the world. And I found these books like exciting and fun and like a YA kind of dystopian kingdom situation, which I do like. Okay. And I think these are worth a read if you're into that, but I'm going to give a different recommendation later that I think is maybe where you should start if you're into that kind of story. That is a little bit of a better series, but this is a good option if you're craving like that kind of vibe. Also, it has like magic in it, so I don't know, it was fun to read. I ate it up very quickly. I was on vacation and I was at like a higher elevation, so I was like kind of nauseous while I was like on this trip. So I was really reading like a lot of the time. Next up, I read a graphic novel actually, and this was right when I got my library card. I got a library card this year. It's amazing. I'm part of the Brooklyn library system, which is like so big that I can get pretty much like any book I want if I request it. And I also use Libby a lot to get ebooks on my Kindle. So I love having a library card. Highly recommend it if you like books and you read books. And I also found myself like reading books that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise, and I also like not having to own every book I read. But the next book I read was a graphic novel, and it was Pumpkinheads by Rainbow Rowell and Faith Erin Hicks. I thought this was very, very sweet. If you want to read a graphic novel that's going to be like a quick read, this is a great one. So next up, I read some Amulet books, and I just counted 1 through 4 as like one book pretty much. I remember reading like the first and second Amulet books when I was like really young. They stuck in my head, and so I was finally able to check some out from the library because it's expensive to buy a lot of graphic novel books. They're so good. I think the final one in the series came out this year or is coming out this year or next year or something. So I think once that happens, I'm gonna read all of them because I didn't actually finish the ones that were out. The art of these is so good and the story is great, and I was obsessed with the characters. Definitely if you're into graphic novels, Amulet is so good. Next up, also from the library, I checked out Nancy and Plum by Betty McDonald. This was a favorite childhood book of mine. I think I was obsessed with reading it in like middle school. I'm not quite sure. It holds up in my head. I loved that book so much when I was younger, and it's still a great book. Definitely one of the best books I read this year. Like I just cherish that story. I think really good like children's books that are a little bit older a lot of the time have amazing lessons in them. Like I just, I love having a shift in perspective from a book. That is one of the reasons I read books, and I always find something of value in pretty much every single book I read. So yeah, even with just like pleasure reading, even if I'm reading like a book that's like not that great, sometimes the author has something to say. Usually they have something to say because they wrote a whole book. Next, I read The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. I loved this book so much. I think the only reason I didn't really continue the series that far was because I was like getting tired of dealing with the library book loan situation because I got a little out of control, I'm gonna be honest. I loved this book so much. It was actually the first book ever where I've been like, I wish I could live in this world. That is saying something. And I'm definitely going to reread it, and I'm definitely going to read the whole series when I get the chance. I was obsessed with it. Next up, I read Defy the Night and Defend the Dawn by Bridget Kemmerer. And this is the series that I would recommend first before The Prison Healer for similar vibes. I love these books so much. The third one's coming out in January, and I'm really excited to reread the whole series because I loved it that much. And in the second book, they're like on a ship, and that totally influenced my next read. I was just looking for some like pirate fantasy book because I was so obsessed with these two, and nothing could live up to it. So these were a favorite of mine this year, and I think they're YA, so like they're chill. I would definitely recommend them for that kind of like kingdom romance, but still political and stuff. There's like a plague situation, like it's great. But as I was saying, I was influenced to read like a pirate type book after that, so I read On These Black Sands by Vanessa Rassinen, and this was on Kindle Unlimited, and I honestly did not love this book. It was just like a little too intense for me, but then like not well enough written for me to feel fine about how intense it was. Sort of like intense subject matter, but then like the writing couldn't hold it up. You know, this might be like one of her first books, and I never want to like make an author if they like saw me talking about them, which they're definitely not going to, but I would never want to make an author like feel bad by me saying that, because I think that especially with new authors, like writing is something you learn by doing. So yeah, if you wrote a whole book and you wanted to get it on Kindle Unlimited, and it maybe was your first book, and maybe it's your first piece of work and you're really proud of it, but there's room to grow, like, I'm happy for you. Next, I read The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, a very hyped book. And honestly, I was expecting a lot more romance in here than there was. I feel like there wasn't really much romance at all. I kind of have realized, like, fae to me, it's not my thing. Now I'm remembering Heart of the Raven Prince had fae in it, and I was also kind of not into that. That pulls me out a little bit. This also has fae. I just am not, I can't do it. It's not for me. So I don't know if I'm gonna continue reading this series, but I did think that it was really well written. This was good. Next, I read Murder on Black Swan Lane and Murder at Half Moon Gate by Andrea Penrose. I think I'm not the target audience for this. I think the target audience is maybe a little older, so I was not super into it, but I did appreciate how slow the romance was taking place. Like, it's developing over multiple books. I did appreciate that. I mean, I thought the books were interesting. I read them, I liked them, but I wouldn't be like possessive over them, you know what I mean? After that, I read Fourth Wing. Duh. Everyone had to this year. I think I got that on the Libby app. I really liked Fourth Wing. I thought it was really fun to read, and I'm gonna reread it before I read the next one. So I'm gonna wait a while to read it again. Kind of reminded me a little bit of Divergent, sort of similar like social dynamics happening. There's also, I think this is the only book I read this year, maybe besides, I don't know if there's any in Dealing with Dragons, but I think that's the only book I read this year where there's like a non-binary character. So they're a side character, but they exist. So that's a slay. After that, I read Blood and Steel by Helen Scheurer, and this was on Kindle Unlimited. It was kind of smutty and I wasn't really into it. I just didn't care about the characters. It felt like everything happened too fast. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. One thing about the story, you know, that's revealed in the end of the book, it just kind of sits in my head. So I got hooked a little bit. I doubt I'm gonna read the rest of the series, but next I read A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin. You may remember from A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting. Her thing is kind of like Regency era rom-com. So this is another Regency era like rom-com situation. I loved this book. It's so good. Another best read of the year for sure. And the blurb on here is from Taylor Jenkins Reid, and it says, an exciting and original voice, a must-buy author for me. Same Taylor. I was waiting for this book to come out for so long, and I was so excited when it came out, and it did not disappoint. This is definitely like a love triangle situation. There are two possible men, and it does leave you guessing. And I love that. And I feel like rarely does a love triangle situation actually really leave you guessing. But I feel like this one did kind of make me question what was going to happen. I really enjoyed this. Next, I read Outlawed by Anna North. Okay, I take it back. This is the book with the most non-binary presence. Fourth Wing is actually not the only book that had non-binary character in it. This actually has a pretty prevalent character in it who is like non-binary vibe. If you're queer, if you're gender, if you enjoy like The Handmaid's Tale, this is for you. Like, it's definitely like feminist, definitely queer. So good. I really loved it. Definitely one of the best books I read this year. This just spoke to my heart. It definitely didn't feel like something I could read all of at once, like the way that books like Fourth Wing feel, like where you really just want to binge the entire book. Like, I feel like there are kind of like stopping points within this book. Next, I read The Beautiful Bureaucrat by Helen Phillips. This book was incredibly bizarre. If you enjoy bizarre books, this is probably a good one for you. I don't know if I personally loved it, but it's pretty short. So if you like bizarre books and you want a book, or you want a book that's a little shorter that you're gonna get through pretty quickly and easily, this is a good one. And then the last book I read, I'm definitely gonna be finishing like the last two Bridge Kingdom books before the end of the year, but you already know my thoughts on that. The last book I read was Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Probably seen this around online, and you know what? I was influenced. I had to read it. I love seeing when an author is like just a young person and they post videos about them being an author. I love that. And you know what? I've been having eyesight problems, so I bought this book And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read this tiny text, because this book has tiny text. You cannot see, but I can't see either. I literally had to buy this on Kindle so that I was able to read it. But that's also just part of the eyesight problem currently, because I didn't want to hurt myself on this book. I definitely was noticing similarities to other worlds, other books when I was reading this. And honestly, I didn't mind it that much. I think it's a great exercise for a new author. And she definitely really made it her own. So I definitely was a fan of this book, and I will be reading the next installment of the series when it comes out. And I will say that the last like 25% of this book I think was the best part of it in terms of the pacing and everything. Like, I feel like it just flowed, and it really felt like the author got her feet under her. So I thought that was very awesome to see. I felt like reading somebody's like writing improve in real time. So I definitely am appreciative of that. Honestly, I like seeing authors like develop over time in their writing. Like, I do really just appreciate the humanness of that. Was it one of the best books I read this year? Maybe not, but I did really like it, and I do recommend it. So let's talk about audiobooks and books I did not finish very quickly. So on audiobook, I listened to Book Lovers. Was not the biggest fan, but did give me a chance to rest my eyes. I have vertigo for like a couple of weeks, so I couldn't look at shit. So I had to just listen to things in my headphones. So it did get me through that, and for that I am grateful. And then I also listened to the first two books in the series. That's The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel. So I think that's The Alchemist and the Magician, I want to say. And that's by Michael Scott. I thought those were great. I think the third book I started listening to it, but the narrator changed from the first two, and the narrator was just like not as good as the first two, because I was used to the other guy's voice and his voices for all the characters, obviously. But I was actually very into the storyline, and I thought it was fun. If you're into like Harry Potter, definitely same vibe. And I might read the physical versions of that series eventually, because I did enjoy it while it lasted. And then there were two books I didn't finish. The first one was Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. To a niche community, this is terrible. This is terrible news. I just didn't like it. It was too dark for me. I can handle amounts of darkness. I can handle some darkness, but like sometimes it just weighs on me too heavily, and this was one that happened for, and I just could not finish it, and I didn't want to make myself finish it. I was so close to being done with that book, and I was just like, nope. And then I also didn't finish The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and this is actually a great book. The only reason I didn't finish it was because my like library loan expired, and also because the vibe of the book was just like not what I needed at the time. Like, I needed something fun, easy to read, but The Night Circus is kind of all about vibes. Wasn't what I needed, so I didn't finish it. Maybe I'll finish it in the future. Okay, I've been talking for a while now, and I'm tired. So tell me what your favorite books of the year were in the comments. Tell me if you've read any of the books that I've read, because I would love to talk about it. And yeah, I will see you in the next one.